The bulldozers arrived first. Before the crowd gathered, before the phones came out, before anyone on Mikado Street had finished their morning coffee, the machines were already there, idling at the curb like they had always belonged there, like the decision had already been made and the paperwork was just a formality. Which, of course, it was. Mama Cora saw them from the kitchen window. She didn't scream. She didn't call anyone. She just walked to the front door of her restaurant, stood in the frame, and started to cry. Quietly. The way people cry when they are too tired to be loud about it. Sofia Reyes came out from behind the counter and pressed her back against the sign above the door. Mama Cora's Kitchen. The paint was old and the letters were slightly uneven, but the sign had been there for 41 years, and Sofia was not going to let it come down without putting her body in front of it first. Her hands were shaking. Her jaw was locked. She was 23 years old and she had nothing but herself, so she used herself. And then the corner table, Table 4, where a quiet man had been sitting every morning for nearly 3 weeks with cracked shoes and cheap coffee and the particular stillness of someone carrying something heavy, was empty. He was gone. In his place, 4 black SUVs rolled to a stop along the street. The doors opened one by one. Out stepped a man in a slate-gray suit with Italian leather shoes and dark lenses that he removed slowly, deliberately, the way powerful people do things when they want the room to understand that they are never in a hurry. The crowd gasped. Señor Rodrigo Vargas Montiel, founder of Vargas Capital Group, the man whose signature had approved the demolition of every building on this block. Sofia stared at him, and the recognition moved across her face like a slow tide pulling back from shore, revealing something underneath that had always been there, something she hadn't known to look for until this exact moment. She knew that face, just not like this. She crossed the street toward him, not running, walking, which was somehow worse. Her chin was level, her eyes were burning. She said, "You lied to me." He didn't flinch, he didn't look away, he didn't offer an explanation, not yet, because he understood that an explanation offered too quickly is just another way of avoiding the weight of what you did. She said, "You sat in my mother's restaurant for almost 3 weeks. You let me bring you water. You let me call you Señor." She stopped, rearranged something inside herself. Then she said, "Was any of it real to you? Was any of it real at all?" He opened his mouth. She cut him off with her eyes. He closed it. 3 weeks earlier, before the cracked shoes and the bench near the park and the 40,000 pesos that had to last an unknown number of days, he had been sitting in a boardroom on the 42nd floor of his own tower, watching Medellin sparkle in the afternoon light below and saying something careless. The kind of thing you say when you have spent so many years above a city that you have forgotten what it feels like to be inside it. He said the poor stay poor because they make poor choices. He said it was simple. Discipline, focus, ambition. 3 things. That was the entire difference between his life and theirs. His business partner Marco Delgado set down his pen, slowly, the way a man does when he has already decided something and is just waiting for the right moment to say it. Marco said, "Then prove it." Rodrigo looked up. Marco said, "Live like them. 2 weeks, no money, no credit cards, no assistance, no security, no name. Walk into the city as a man with nothing and come back in 14 days and tell me it's only about choices." Rodrigo agreed too quickly. He always did when the terms seemed manageable. He thought it would be uncomfortable in a productive way, a story he could tell at dinner, a week of mild inconvenience followed by a returned sense of gratitude for everything he had built. It was not that. The first night he lay on a concrete bench near the Parque de los Pies Descalzados and learned something nobody had ever told him, which was that the city does not quiet down for people who have nowhere to go. The heat stays, the noise stays, the hunger does not politely announce itself, it takes up residence in your body and stops asking permission. He had 40,000 pesos, roughly $10. He applied for dishwashing work at 3 restaurants the next morning. 2 doors didn't open, the third opened just long enough for a man to look him over for 4 seconds and say they were full. 4 seconds. 4 seconds to assess a man's entire worth and find it insufficient. He sat on a curb on Mercado Street and ate half a bread roll he bought from a street vendor and watched the city move around him like water around a stone it had already decided to work past. People didn't look at him, not with hostility, just with the practiced indifference of people who have learned to navigate around whatever doesn't require their attention. He had moved markets, he had been on the covers of business magazines, he had walked into rooms that rearranged themselves around his entrance, and on Mercado Street, in cracked canvas shoes with a bread roll and 40,000 pesos, he did not exist. That was when he noticed Mama Cora's kitchen. Hand-painted sign, plastic chairs visible through the open door, a chalkboard menu with prices that had been adjusted so many times the old numbers were still faintly visible underneath the new ones, a history of hard seasons written in chalk. He went in. He counted his pesos 3 times before ordering the smallest thing on the board, caldo and water. He sat at table 4 and nobody looked at him twice. Except her. Sofia was moving through the narrow spaces between tables with the fluid efficiency of someone who had long ago made peace with not having enough room. She was carrying 4 things at once. She remembered orders without writing them down. She laughed at a regular's joke with the kind of ease that suggested she genuinely found it funny, even though she had almost certainly heard it before. When she came to his table, she placed a glass of water in front of him and said, "Good afternoon, senor." A man nearby snorted. She ignored him completely. She looked at Rodrigo and waited, the way you wait when you actually care about the answer. He said, "Yes, please, water." She refilled his glass. He said, "Thank you." She nodded and moved to the next table, and that was the entire exchange. But something about the ordinary completeness of it, the unremarkable human decency of being seen and addressed and attended to as though it was simply what everyone deserved, cracked something open in him that he did not know had been sealed. He came back the next day. She noticed him counting his coins and said nothing. She simply placed an extra arepa at the edge of his tray as she passed, without eye contact, without ceremony, as though it had always been part of the order. He stared at it for a moment before eating. On the 3rd visit, he learned her name, Sofia Reyes. Final year of business administration at the university, partial scholarship, 6 mornings a week here, 3 evenings at a pharmacy, university on whatever time was left. She told him this without complaint, the way you describe the weather, a simple fact with no request for sympathy attached. He came back again, and slowly, the way you learn the shape of something by walking around it slowly, he learned more. That her mother had kidney disease, that she managed the dialysis schedule around both jobs, that she had been doing this since she was 17, that Mama Cora sometimes fed the university students even when their money visibly ran short, that the woman who came alone every Friday and sat long after finishing her meal was always brought coffee by Sofia without being asked, that this restaurant was not just a place where food was served, it was a place where people were held. On the 9th day, he was walking back toward his bench when he saw the yellow flyers. Bright, aggressive, taped to every lamppost and shopfront on the block. Coming soon, Vargas Capital, Nuevo Medellin Commercial Corridor, Phase 1, District Redevelopment, groundbreaking in 60 days. Below the headline, a map. He recognized the grid immediately. He had approved it. The entire block shaded in the color that in planning documents meant scheduled for acquisition and demolition. He looked at the authorization line at the bottom of the page. Approved by R. Vargas Montiel, Vargas Capital Group. His own signature. He stood on the pavement for a long time. The street kept moving. He did not. He remembered the file. February, one of 40 at week. His assistant had flagged it as routine. He had reviewed the projected returns, confirmed the square footage, signed where indicated. It had taken him less than a minute. He had not asked what was in the buildings. He had not asked who would lose what they had spent decades building. He had not asked about Mama Cora. He had not asked about Sofia. He understood then something that no financial model had ever shown him, that there is a particular kind of shame that arrives not when you meant to cause harm, but when you realize you never even thought to ask. That indifference, practiced long enough, becomes its own kind of cruelty. That the distance between his signature and this street was not geography. It was the decision, made quietly over years, never to look. He did not go back to his bench that night. He walked instead, past the restaurant with its chairs stacked and its lights off, past the pharmacy where Sofia worked evenings, past the hospital where her mother went twice a week, past the university where she was somehow, still building something, still reaching forward with both hands full. He stopped at a corner and looked up at the Vargas Capitol Tower, his tower, lights burning on the upper floors at midnight. He looked at his hands, same signature, different weight. He made one call, 7 words. Get the Mercado file ready. I'm coming in. He walked into the boardroom the next morning in the same clothes he had worn on the street, to the barely concealed discomfort of every executive in the room, and he said, cancel a Mercado Street demolition. The room did not take this well. Federico, the head of development, leaned forward and said the contracts were essentially executed. Investor communications had gone out. The groundbreaking was 60 days away. Rodrigo said to restructure around the eastern parcels. Legal counsel said they had binding acquisition agreements and that pulling out now would expose the firm to significant liability. Rodrigo said to absorb the costs. The investor liaison said this would hit the stock, that analysts would say he had gone soft, that Vargas Capital would be seen as a company that couldn't be trusted to execute. Rodrigo looked at the room and said, full compensation for every business on that block. Market rate plus 18 months disruption offset. Legal has 48 hours. The property deed for the restaurant transfers to its operator today. Clear title, free of debt. And then he said, we are launching the Community Anchor Initiative, a fund, a legal framework to make sure no family business in this city is ever erased by a signature it never saw coming. Federico started to speak. Rodrigo looked at him. Federico stopped. Nobody in that room agreed with him, but they could see in his face that this had not been decided here. It had been decided on a sidewalk, at night, alone, and that kind of decision does not come back up for a vote. And so it was that on what was supposed to be demolition morning, with the machines idling and Mama Cora crying in the doorway and Sofia Reyes pressing her back against a faded sign, the black SUVs arrived, and the man who stepped out was the same man who had sat at table 4 with cracked shoes and counted coins. Sofia walked toward him and said, "You lied to me." He said, "I didn't tell you everything, that's different, but I understand why it doesn't feel different from where you're standing." She said, "You don't know how I would have treated you. You don't know that." He said, "Neither do you." Then he said, "You called a man in cracked shoes Senor, and you meant it, in a world that had already decided he didn't deserve the word. I needed to see who you were when I was worth nothing to you, because that is who a person actually is." She held his gaze. Something shifted in her expression. Not forgiveness, something older and more durable than forgiveness. Understanding. He turned to the site foreman and said, "Engines off." One by one, the machines went quiet. He raised his voice to carry across the gathered crowd, and he said the demolition was cancelled, that this property was being transferred to its owner today, free of debt and free of condition, that every business on this block would receive full compensation, that this district would become the first protected zone under the Community Anchor Initiative, a fund to ensure that what almost happened here would never happen again. Mama Cora sat down on the front step of her restaurant and covered her face with her apron and made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite laughing and was entirely human. The crowd was still, because something true had just happened in front of them, and people go quiet when something is true. Later, Marco appeared at his shoulder. Rodrigo said, "You planned this." Marco said, "I gave you a street. You chose the table." Then he said, "I just needed you to know one of them by name."
6 months later, Mercado Street looked different. Fresh paint, new awnings, a community garden where there had been a vacant lot, a mural on the sidewall of the restaurant depicting the street as it had looked decades ago, full of faces and color and the particular energy of a place that knows what it is. Senora Bautista was receiving consistent treatment. The specific kind of dread that comes not from hard work, but from impossible arithmetic, from a bill you cannot manage and an appointment you cannot miss, had slowly lifted from Sofia's shoulders. She now directed the Community Anchor Initiative, sitting in rooms with city planners and development lawyers, reading the parts of contracts that most people in those rooms had learned to skip, asking questions that made legal teams reach for their pens. And sometimes, in the late afternoon, when the lunch rush had ended and the light came through the front windows at an angle that made the whole room warm and golden, a man would walk in without an entourage and sit at table 4. He no longer wore cracked shoes, but he didn't order anything that needed to announce itself. Just water, sometimes the caldo, please and thank you, a fair tip, not a performance. Sofia would cross the room, place the glass in front of him, and she would say, "Good afternoon, Senor Rodrigo." Same words as the first time. Different weight. She would walk back to the kitchen and he would wrap both hands around the glass and sit with the sounds of the room. The clatter of trays, the radio playing, something Mama Cora hummed along to without noticing, the particular noise of a place that is alive. He would stay, not because it was a lesson, because he had learned the difference between knowing about a place and knowing a place, and he understood that this knowledge could not be acquired from a quarterly report or a planning document or a window 42 floors above a city. You have to sit in the plastic chair. You have to count the coins. You have to be seen or not seen and feel in your body what that does to a person over time. The most powerful thing Rodrigo ever did wasn't canceling the demolition. It was sitting at that table long enough to learn someone's name. We make decisions every day that affect people we've never met. We sign things, we approve things, we move on. But behind every number is a person. Behind every building is a life. Sofia never waited to know who you were before treating you with respect. She gave dignity freely because that was her standard for every human being. The lesson is simple. Get close enough to be changed. Treat people well before you know what they're worth. That changes everything.